Man, I'm fighting all sorts of battles to record this episode. Alright, so hello everyone. I'm back with another reading wrap up, but this time isn't just for 1 month, but rather 3 because I've been very busy these past few months, so I wasn't able to record wrap ups for January, February, or March. But now I have the time, so we're going to get it done. Whew. So, despite how busy I was, I actually managed to read quite a few books. So, because I don't want this episode to be 3 hours long, I ended up paring the list down to remove all of my DNF books and also common rereads, because it's likely that I will reread them again in the future and I can just talk about it then in a future wrap up. But for now, let's just dive right into my list of what turned out to be 20 books across 3 months. So, for the month of January, the first book that I read was called A Snicker of Magic by Natalie Lloyd Jones. And this is a book that follows Felicity Pickle and her family as they move to Midnight Gulch, which is where her mother grew up. The thing about the Pickle family is that they move around a lot. Felicity's mom has what you could say is a wandering heart, so the Pickle family never stays in one place for long. And this book picks up when they move to Midnight Gulch. I don't know why I said that. Okay. The main thing about Midnight Gulch is the fact that it used to have magic, but then something happened in the past that caused all the magic to go away. So we have 2 things going on in this book. We're trying to resolve the issue as to why the magic left Midnight Gulch, but also just sorting out the different feelings of the different members of the Pickle family as they deal with having to constantly move around and never being able to feel like they're truly at home. And I would say that this book wasn't bad, but it wasn't necessarily amazing either. I actually have read this book before, but that was actually way back in elementary school because my teacher bought me this book as a reward for doing something, maybe good behavior. And I don't remember. But when I first read this book, and even now, I really liked the small town community feeling and also the descriptions of the ice cream, which I know sounds very random given my description of what the plot is about, but it is actually relevant to the story. And I feel like that was about it. The only thing is that I kind of forgot that this book takes place in the southern United States. So when I was listening to the audiobook version of this recently, back in January, I guess, I was I was surprised to hear a southern twang, but then it makes sense because this book is taking place somewhere in the southern United States, so it was fun. And the only other thing is just that I think I'm not sure how to put this, but sometimes I felt like the characters were a little bit hard to relate to just because they were all white. And while race or an ethnic background isn't normally something I pay attention to in books, the setting and some of the historical details mentioned in this book, such as the American Civil War, made me really aware of how white the town was and the lack of diversity, which could make me a little uncomfortable at times, but it wasn't necessarily problematic. It just made me more appreciate the fact that these days we do have access to books that have more diverse characters or are just written by more diverse authors. So I love progress. Alright, so continuing on with me rereading books that I read back in my youth, we have 2 books from this series called Secret, and I'm not going to attempt to try to explain in my own words what this series is about, just because it's very quirky and has a bit of a unique concept. So I'll just read the synopsis for the first book, which is called The Name of This Book is Secret by Pseudonymous Bosch. Here we go. Read the series that sold more than 2 million copies, if you dare. Warning, this description has not been authorized by Pseudonymous Bosch. As much as he'd love to sing the praises of his book, he is very vain. He wouldn't want you to hear about his brave 11-year-old heroes, Cass and Max Ernest, or about how a mysterious box of vials, the symphony of smells, sends them on the trail of a magician who has vanished under strange and stinky circumstances. And he certainly wouldn't want you to know about the hair-raising adventures that follow and the nefarious villains they face. You see, not only is the name of this book secret, the story inside it is too, for it concerns a secret, a big secret. So I hope you get from this little blurb the kind of vibe that you're in for as you read this book. It's very silly. You can't really take it seriously. The characters and the plot are pretty unusual. There's just lots of little random details that come into play. I think, especially because for me, I was listening to the audiobook version of this recently, they have a full cast, so you have different voice actors coming in to play the different roles, which was a fun experience to listen to. I think that's really all I have to say about it. The other book from the series that I read was This Book Is Not Good For You by Pseudonymous Bosch, same author. I only read the first book and This Book Is Not Good For You just because I think when I was younger I read most of the books in this series, and these two books were the ones that were my favorite. They're the only ones that really stuck with me, to be honest. Just because the name of this book is secret is just, you're kind of learning more about where this story takes place, and then This Book Is Not Good For You is about chocolate, which is fun. Alright, next we're exiting my rereading books from when I was in middle school phase and jumping on to a book that was published more recently called Heavenly Tyrant by Xiran Zhao, which is the second book in the Iron Widow series. And if you don't know, the Iron Widow first book is about this, how do I describe this? So we're in this country called Huaxia, and there are these monsters called Hunduns that constantly attack the country. So the Huaxia citizens need a way to defend themselves, and they do that by having these pilots that get into these chrysalis mechas and fight back against the Hunduns. And the way that the pilot system works is that you have a female and male pair inside these mechas, but it's not a balanced arrangement. The males are basically the ones that take control of the chrysalises, and they use their chi and the female pilot's chi to move and use these mechas. And the female pilots are basically just concubines, essentially, because at the end of these battles, the female pilots end up dying because they're so drained by the way that the mechas work, I guess, if that makes sense. Let me see if I can explain that better. So inside the mechas, you have the male and female pair, and they have it arranged so that, not arranged, but just the way things work out, it's that the male pilots tend to dominate the female pilots in terms of chi usage, and if you use out all your chi, you end up dying. So that means that basically every time the chrysalises go into battle, these female pilots are just dying left, right, and center. They're drained by the end of the battles, and the male pilots survive, and they just have to take on another female pilot. And how it ends up working is that, yes, it turns into a bit of a concubine system. With the way things work out, it's kind of icky. And Iron Widow follows this girl named Zetian, who offers herself up to be a concubine pilot because she wants to take revenge for the pilot that killed her sister, who was drafted, or I think it's like her parents sent her, or like the sister was drafted in to become a pilot. And so Zetian wants vengeance, but I think that's pretty much all I can say with regards to the first book without spoiling. The second book, Heavenly Tyrant, continues off with the ending of the first book, where we learn some pretty earth-shattering information about the world that Seolyeon lives in. And it was quite a cliffhanger, so I was very curious to see how that would be resolved in the second book, but unfortunately I ended up being very disappointed with it because I felt like the story was not fully fleshed out, and it got very boring and very messy in a bad way pretty quickly. And the only reason why I kept reading was just because I wanted to know more about the information that we learned at the end of Iron Widow. And basically I just ended up skimming because I was just having such a terrible time reading this book, unfortunately. I hate to say it, but I think this was my first one-star read, which is kind of wild. I think in my previous episode with my sister, I mentioned that when rating books, I usually never rate it that low because my mentality is that since I only rate books after I've finished the entire thing, if I do end up coming across a 1 or 2-star book, I'm probably not going to finish it. But then the more I was thinking about it, I think I should just rate books that I finish on the full scale, like don't just back off on the 1 or 2-star ratings just because I said that I would never finish a 1 or 2-star book. I mean, because this book basically proved that to me. I changed my rating system because of this book. I had such a terrible time doing it. And let me try to explain why. So, while I understand that the circumstances the characters were operating under in this book were very chaotic because some stuff went down in the previous book where things were just falling apart, it was utter chaos, I think the author could have done a better job of just focusing on a single issue as we try to put things back together, such as, like Seolyeon trying to should I just spoil? Because I feel like I don't want to spoil, but I'll try to explain this in a way that's not too spoilery. So basically, I think the author could have done a better job on just focusing on a single issue that we need to fix, such as Seolyeon just coming to understand the challenges of coming into power or just gaining new power, because in the previous book, as the Hwasha society is very, they're very misogynist and sexist, so women are very mistreated. But suddenly, as a pilot and later on beyond being a pilot, as she gains more power, she learns that basically with great power comes great responsibility. And I think that would have been really interesting if we had focused on that for most of the book, but instead it felt like we were focusing on many different things at once, which made things just very confusing and pretty, it just made it hard for me to tell what was going on, to be honest. And then that also meant that because we were focusing on so many different things, I felt like we never really followed through with the aftermath of different plot beats. So, for example, in Heavenly Tyrant, there's this very big mistake that Seolyeon, or not even a mistake, but she just messed up. She lost a battle, and you would think that based on what happens, there would be very big, widespread consequences of what was going to happen. But we never really followed up on it. So I was just kind of left hanging, wow, a lot of people just died. You just made this huge mistake. And you messed up at your one job, but we're just not going to think about how we're going to fix this. I thought you guys would be more worried about this. And on top of that, let's see. On top of that, let me pause. I'm looking at my notes because I for this book I was just so upset I wrote a whole basically mini essay on it. So I was saying that we never really followed through different plot beats. And personally, I've kind of already hinted this, but I would have liked to see more of focusing on Zetian's growth and mindset as she gains familiarity with different political and social issues as she's coming more into power as a pilot and more. Hint at the title of the book. So, especially because there was also these discussions of, I don't know how to put it, like toxic feminism, because Zetian, I don't know why, but she's getting these visions from her older sister and as well as this other character named Qingzheng, who makes some valid points on how Zetian is trying to quote-unquote help women, but her actions don't really help as much as she thinks, because they, first of all, they just don't have a large enough scope, and they also conform to her own definition of womanhood, which doesn't necessarily embrace the idea of femininity. I feel like everyone has their own definition of womanhood, but Zetian's approach is more of forcing her own ideologies onto everyone else, and also just making uneducated decisions, because I felt like she wasn't even really trying to educate herself anyways on the true state of how the world works, because she was a poor peasant girl in the first book. She didn't get a chance to get a full education, or she doesn't even know how to read or write. But now that she has these resources at her disposal, she's just spouting all these things, but not really, even though people are telling her like, oh, you don't know how this works, like, don't you know that this is how it works? She doesn't really, I feel like she just kind of gets mad. She doesn't really take the time to put in the effort to kind of, maybe follow up with learning. So that was tough. But also, from a more general perspective, there wasn't a lot of world building either, so I had a lot of trouble visualizing where everything was taking place, except for at the end, where we end up at a special place. But even so, it was still a mess. Even the plot at the end was also just very messy, because this part is going to be a spoiler because I just need to talk about it. So I'll see if I can't add a timestamp for when you can skip to if you don't want to hear spoilers. But basically, at the end, we end up going to the Heavenly Court. In order to get there, Zetian is tracking the Heavenly Court using Shimin's spirit signature, and she notices that the spirit signature is coming from two different places at once, which kind of makes sense because in the end of the previous book, he got really injured, so there's parts of him. And when she gets attacked and killed by one of the spirit signatures, it ends up being Shimin, so she ends up killing him, but then the other one remains. So I thought that we would try to spend some time figuring out why Shimin's spirit signature was still persisting, but then after Zetian spends some time looking around and she goes to where the second spirit signature was, she just says that she must have been gaslighting herself into thinking that there's still hope for Shimin and that he's still alive even though he's dead, and then we just move on. So it just felt really weird because there was like no tension whatsoever throughout the whole stint at the Heavenly Court, despite the circumstances. So then we just have Zetian saying like, oh, actually I was gaslighting myself, and then it just felt really unnatural where we had like Shimin's death. It just felt really awkwardly placed, like as if we were supposed to I'm not sure how to explain it. It just felt off. There was like so much whiplash going on. It just felt like the plot just felt so jerky, if that makes sense. I was like, you guys are infiltrating the Heavenly Court where the gods are, and then it just doesn't feel like there's any sense of urgency, and then suddenly there is a sense of urgency because you just killed the guy you love. And I thought you would be like more I was kind of like, you gotta pick a focus. Like, do you want this to be really tense, or do you not? I don't understand why you defaulted to just saying that you're gaslighting yourself into thinking that the guy you like is still alive. I feel like I'm not explaining this well. But part of it is just because what happened just really didn't make any sense. Maybe I'm missing something. But anyways, as such, I just want to say the epilogue and the ending of the book were not satisfying at all, and they were just super messy, and it honestly made me kind of angry because I felt like I was wasting my time with this book. I really didn't feel like I got anything out of it. I have no idea if this book is going to be a trilogy instead of a duology, and I honestly don't really care to know, just because I don't know what I just read, but it was a mess. I may try doing one of those plot summaries just so that I can, literally only for my sake, just so that I can kind of wrap my head around how the plot was supposed to be and the different character relationships, just so that I can reassure myself that I'm not crazy, because maybe I was missing something. Like I said, I was very busy during this time reading this book, so maybe I just was blanking out the whole time. Who knows? That was my 1-star book. Anyways, the next book I read is called A Magical Girl Retires by Park Seolyeon, and this book is about... First of all, I just want to say that the cover, gorgeous. I loved it. So, this book takes place in a world where magical girls exist, and the main character is this... I don't know if she's middle-aged or not. She's a millennial who is depressed. She has a ton of credit card debt, and so she tries to take the easy way out. So she tries to, unfortunately she tries to commit suicide, but she gets stopped by this girl, her quote-unquote guardian angel, who tells her basically that we need you. You are a magical girl. You are the magical girl of time that we need to stop the effects of climate change. And that's basically how how the story continues. It's been a while since I've read this book, so I can't really remember the fine details, but I will say that this book was a little bit different than what I expected. I thought it would be a very I thought it would have more action. I think just because I was expecting like a Mahou Shoujo manga kind of vibe, but it really wasn't that case. It still moved at a fast pace, but I think the focus was more on a human connection rather than the magic itself, if that makes sense. So let me look at my notes. So basically I felt like the story itself was good. But it was a little strange. First of all, it was a lot shorter than I thought, and things moved pretty quickly. I actually wish that the book itself was a little longer and that we could have spent more time on some of the world building, especially because, like I said, we didn't really get to experience as much magic as you would expect from a book about magical girls. But I also understand that the point of the story was actually not to be like a magical girl anime. I think it was more to showcase that juxtaposition between magical girls in shows and the magical girls that we need in real life. And other than that, I didn't really like the narrator too much, just because she didn't have much of a personality, but I think that's just more of a personal thing. I personally prefer to read books that have a likable main character, but it's nice to be able to read from different perspectives. Other than that, just with this narrator, it just felt a bit weird at times because I know she was saying things, but they didn't really have much substance. But it was fine. It wasn't that big of a deal. I think I still enjoyed reading this book. I'm, again, talking about this book 3 months after having read it, so I can't say I remember too much of the specifics, but I think once again just focusing on how this book is about talking about those magical girls we see in these shows versus kind of like, I think the magical girls that we need in real life that will help actually change the world or solve world problems is that core message of the book, and I really appreciated that. The next book I read is called The Hen Who Dreamed She Could Fly by Sunmi Hwang. And this book follows I think she's a hen, right? She's a hen who lays eggs, but she has never had a chick. She's just meant to be laying eggs that people eat. And she ends up finding an egg and raising it as her own. And that's what this book is mostly about. I remember hearing about this book from a Carrie Can Read video, and I learned that it was a sad book, but I actually don't think that was the case. I think it was a more heartwarming book that was a little bittersweet at times, but it wasn't sad in kind of like a depressing way that feels hopeless. I think the concept of this book reminded me a lot of the Wild Robot movie. I actually haven't read the book yet, but if it's similar to the movie, it's gave me those vibes, just because we're following the journey of an unlikely mother raising her child. And while there were tragic moments, there were also uplifting ones as well. Just a more funny note is the fact that sometimes I would forget that we were reading from the perspective of a hen, and then the author would drop something like, "Oh, the hen clenched her beak," instead of saying like, "I clenched my jaw," and then I would be reminded that, yeah, actually all the characters in this book are farm animals and they're talking. So that was just a fun detail. All right. Next book is What You're Looking For is in the Library by Michiko Aoyama, and I've mentioned this actually in one of the bonus segments of one of my previous episodes, and I know I said that I got rid of some of my rereads, but I wanted to bring this one up just because I read this book for my second time in January, and I enjoyed it a lot more than the first time I read it, just because the topics and the experience of the characters were more relevant to me this time around. But with me, graduating and then ascending into the real adult world, and the realizations made by each character all struck a chord with me and gave me a more hopeful and sustainable outlook on the world and just growing up. Since I am someone who tends to overthink and get stressed at how complicated the world can be, and just how many factors are out of your control. However, I think through these characters, I was able to understand how, despite how many factors may be out of your control, if you just focus on what you can do in the moment, life goes on. I feel like you don't need to be perfect in order to function or in order to live a good life. Everything will be okay. You don't need to be a master over all domains. So because of just how much this book struck a chord in me, I'm definitely going to be rereading this again soon, maybe in the coming months. We'll see. Alright, next book number 8, is Arch Enemies by Marissa Meyer. This is the second book in, I forgot the name, the Renegades trilogy, I believe. Let me see. Yeah, the Renegades trilogy. And I am not gonna try to spoil it, but basically this series takes place in a world where you have people who have superpowers, and the two main characters of this book, one is Nova. She's a villain, basically. She's a villain who is trying to infiltrate the hero organization. And then the second main character is... Why can't I remember his name? Oh no. What's his name? It's Nova and Adrian. And Adrian is the son of of two of the heroes who make up the prime governing body, I guess, of the city. So he's the son of the two of the biggest heroes in the city. And yeah, so we have things getting messy. I feel like I don't have much to say about Arch Enemies. It was a good read that continues off of what happened in the first book, and I feel like it was about the same as the first book in terms of rating, which is impressive to me because I'm used to it being the case where the first book is the strongest and then things go downhill from there. I feel like this book was a pretty smooth and seamless continuation from the first one, and there's some new developments and things get a little bit more messy, but I feel like we're not quite at the darkest hour just yet. But I just want to say that I'm not a gossip, but I can't wait to see how things finally start falling apart, or how the lies begin to unravel in the final book, just because I'm curious to see how things will be resolved and whether or not the characters are able to make changes to the obviously flawed current social structure with regards to people's attitudes towards heroism. Alright, next, moving right along, is The Crescent Moon Tea Room by Stacy Savinsky. And this book is kind of meant to be one of those, like cozy reads because it's about a little tea shop. Or at least that was my impression when I first read the blurb, but that actually wasn't really what I got when I actually read it. So, a little synopsis. This book follows a set of triplets who own a tea room together, and they are they spend their days reading tea leaves and telling the fortunes of their clients. And one day the Council of Witches comes calling on the three sisters to use their divination powers to help these other witches on complete a certain task, basically. But while that's happening, excuse me for a second. While that's happening, the sisters learn that there's a curse on them, and things just start falling apart because the three sisters were pretty inseparable, and they're always together, and they are basically, it's kind of expected or unspoken that they're just going to stay at the tea shop together and just forever, essentially. But then with the council calling on them and just some certain other happy accidents or events that start happening, we start to see that maybe this sort of arrangement is not the best for the three sisters. And we go on from there. I think I liked the initial concept of having a sentient tea house run by witches who tell your fortune, but upon actually reading the book, I thought it was kind of boring because it just felt a little underwhelming, and the plot felt like just fell flat. It wasn't as cozy as I would have liked, and the plot felt pretty jerky and stilted at times just because of how many point of view switches there were going on between chapters, and sometimes within the same paragraph as well. Personally, I felt like there wasn't enough substance of the story to feel particularly connected or invested in any of the sisters, and honestly, I was kind of confused at times on why the sisters were so insistent on staying together as one unit like they were in the past, even though clearly, first of all, they're not the same person, and obviously as life goes on, you're going to grow and have your own personalities. Even currently in the past, the sisters all acknowledge that, Beatrix is very reserved and quiet. Violet is she's like a free spirit, kind of daydreams. And then Anne is like the glue that holds them together. She's just very talented at what she does. So they already kind of knew that they're all different from each other, but for some reason they just kept insisting that we need to force ourselves to be together and just be the same. And on top of that, just some of the plot details felt pretty heavy-handed. For example, we would have this one character who was the triplets' mother's friend just constantly coming in for the sole purpose of just pronouncing to the reader that the curse that the sisters have is just getting worse. That was the only reason why she came in. And then, it just felt kind of annoying because she's just coming yeah, it's getting worse. And for me, I was like, yeah, I can tell that things are getting worse. These sisters are a mess right now. So it was basically a kind of distraction and unwelcome intrusion, especially because the author was painting things as if this friend of our mother's is also a very dear friend to us, the sisters. But it did not feel like that at all. And finally, just like, this next part's a spoiler, I can't say. But that's basically all I want to say with regards to this book. Yeah, it was a bit disappointing. I feel like I just didn't really enjoy it, unfortunately. Alright, so that was the last book that I read in January that I want to talk about. We're halfway through. Now we're gonna just go through February and March, and I think I liked my February and March books more. I'm just happier with the books that I read, so I'm excited. Let me just drink some water first real quick. Alright, so the first book I want to talk about for February is Trust of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. Sorry, I slurred my words there. Brandon Sanderson. And this was my first Brandon Sanderson book, I actually think. I have to say that I thoroughly enjoyed myself reading this book. I don't think the plot of this book was particularly interesting. Like, it wasn't, it didn't feel out of the ordinary, but I appreciated the jokes and comparisons and the plot details. It just, even though I feel like the bare bones of the plot wasn't exactly original, everything else was very refreshing, and I got a few good laughs out of it. I should talk about what it's about, though. It's following the journey of this girl who goes by Tress just because she has this long, beautiful locks, and she ends up having to go on this quest to save her prince is the best way I can explain it. But then we have some additional quirks on the fact that where Tress lives, her island is surrounded by this emerald green ocean made up of spores instead of water. And when water makes contact with these spores, they grow into these plants that could make spore voyages very treacherous. And yeah, so we get to have fun with that. Alright, so the next book I want to talk about is The Fractured Dark by Megan E. O'Keefe. And this is the second book in the Devoured World series. It comes after The Blighted Worlds, I believe. The Blighted Stars, my bad. And this book was similar to the first book. It was bananas to listen to. There were a lot of twists and turns, but I also felt like it didn't quite live up to the standard of the first book in the series. It was still really good. I just felt like some of the main plot details didn't seem necessary. For example, there's this whole detail about this one character named Fletch, who is a character from Naira's past, and he suddenly becomes at the center of everything. Like, he's been preparing for whatever he's doing in this book for a very long time, and so this just meant that, like, he shows up and then he just disappears, so the pacing felt a little bit jerky and like I was being pulled around, but I didn't necessarily mind just because it was a wild ride. I feel like there wasn't much action compared to the first book, and I think it just felt like we were doing more world building and setting up for the finale in the third book, which I am excited to hear. I feel like, yeah, that's about it for this book. I don't have anything specific to say, just because I don't want to get into too many details, since I don't want to spoil the first book, which was really good, and you should definitely read that. The next book I read was Water Moon, and this book is one where it's just, it was a strange experience to read. So the concept is that it's about this pawn shop where customers can go to pawn their regrets or choices that they've made. And the focus of this book is on the pawn shop owner having to retrieve a choice that got stolen from her shop, along with her father, who was the previous pawn shop owner, him disappearing. And she has the help of this mysterious stranger who, I don't know, he just comes into the pawn shop the day after her shop got robbed, and together there's just some instant chemistry, and they go off to solve this mystery. So I was pretty excited when I started reading this book, but then I realized that the concept of the story described in the blurb, and basically what I've just told you, was being executed in a way that I didn't quite expect. I felt like things felt a little shaky, and I wasn't sure I was going to like this book when I first started. However, as I got to the end of the book, I felt like everything came together in a more cohesive way, and a lot of the writing choices made a lot more sense. So that meant that there turned out to be a reason for a lot of the details in the book that I wasn't exactly the biggest fan of in the beginning. So to get into some slightly more specific details, I was thinking that the story would be going at a faster pace and be more intense, just because of the situation at hand, that like the main character's father got kidnapped. So I thought there'd be a little bit more urgency, but actually it was a more whimsical and gentle ride, which was not a bad thing. It just felt a little bit strange and it was slightly unexpected. Yeah, hold on, sorry. I have to adjust myself, this is getting uncomfortable. But yeah, so basically on the quest to find where the main character Hana's dad could be, rather than just rushing through and just like hustling through where's my dad, oh he's here, and then just running off, we would just kind of be set on these little side quests where we were just hopping from destination to destination, exploring these different sites to be seen, which was fun. And I think once I got over the fact that, I guess like things aren't quite as urgent as they seem, if that makes sense, which seems kind of counterintuitive, I was able to just sit back and enjoy the vibes of what was going on. And I actually really did enjoy seeing where the next destination was going to be, just because this pawn shop is not actually in the real world. We're in a separate world. So seeing how this other world works, it just all sounded so dreamy and magical, and I really enjoyed being immersed in that setting. The only thing that I didn't particularly like about this book was just the romance aspect of the plot. As you may have guessed from my brief synopsis of that mysterious stranger, I think it just was very much love at first sight, and I didn't think it was very necessary. It would have been more realistic if they had maybe a platonic relationship. I think it still would have had the same desired effect of just like for later on down the line. But overall, I would say that I had a good time with this book. There were lots of little nuggets of wisdom that struck a chord with me, and I actually did stop to take a note of a couple of them, which is something I don't usually do. And like I said, I really enjoyed some of the more world-building aspects and just learning more about where this pawn shop exists and where Hana grew up. Alright, next book was the third book in the Renegades trilogy, which is Supernova by Marissa Meyer. I don't know how to put this into words exactly, but the plot of this book just felt kind of messy, because this is when things from the first and second book start falling apart, and we have the big final climax of the battle going on. I think it wasn't messy in the execution, to be honest. It was more in the content of the plot itself. It felt like the events going on relative to the events of the past books weren't nearly as grave or serious as it should have been, and a lot of the revelations didn't really, I think it's revelations didn't have quite as strong as an effect as I would have expected. So basically, with some aspects, events taking place felt a little juvenile and honestly very My Hero Academia-esque, like with that one arc where the whole city, like there's that huge battle between the heroes and the villains, and then the whole city somehow has a bunker that all the civilians can go into so that the heroes and villains can fight with minimal civilian casualty. I don't remember. But at the same time, we also had characters handling other situations very maturely and relatively rationally when it came to some of the lies that come out and are revealed. So it was a bit of a strange mix, and not necessarily in a good way, unfortunately. But yeah, I think it wasn't a horrible time, but honestly, I was expecting more. I really thought there would be more commentary on the society that this book takes place in, and maybe some social changes, but I didn't really get that sense, unfortunately. Alright, next book is the last book for February that I'm going to talk about, which is The Darkness Outside Us by Elliot Schreffer. And this book is about... Oh, it's a series. I had no idea. Why is it a series? Okay. Basically, it's about these two boys on a spaceship who wake up with no memory of the launch, and things are kind of suspicious because the evidence of like the status of the ship kind of indicates that, you know, someone else has been aboard, and it's kind of strange that they don't remember the launch itself because they never... Let me back up. Okay. So... Okay, so this book is about two boys who are on a spaceship on a space mission to, I forget, do what. It's a very important mission for the sake of humanity, basically. I don't mean to brush it off like that, but really, that's basically it. And they both wake up and they have no memory of the launch, which is very suspicious, especially considering the fact that there's some evidence that someone else has also been on board the ship and messing with things around. That sentence didn't make any sense. Messing around with things. And so the two boys kind of have to figure out what is going on, and also learn to trust each other too, because they are from sworn like nations that are kind of not having a good relationship with each other. So it's very interesting. I honestly didn't think that I would like this book because I kind of knew that there would be some kind of insta-love attraction going on between the two boys, and I'm just not a fan of insta-love. But I mean, I was correct that there was insta-love, but I actually didn't mind that much because I feel like the rest of the plot, like this mystery with regards to the fact that how suspicious their circumstances are, really made up for it, because it kind of reminded me a lot of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it was kind of similar just because you have these two astronauts on a ship being guided by an artificial intelligence, and it was similar to an extent, but we actually ended up going on a slightly different direction relative to the movie. And I liked how this book was definitely very eerie and creepy at times, and you kind of start to unravel the mystery along with the characters. And man, some of the things I was not expecting. And some of the things it was like, oh no, like you realize pretty early on, and then you see the evidence that that's actually what happened, and you're just like, ooh. So it was a good time. That was my last book for February, so overall, it was a pretty solid reading month for February. Alright, now home stretch. We got a couple more books left, just 5 more. This is for March. So, the first few books I read in March were all 3 books in the Illuminae Files trilogy, which were written by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. And I just want to say that I love the audiobooks for these 3 books. I've never read the actual book version, only the audiobook version, just because the ones that I listen to have a full cast. It's basically fully immersive because there's lots of sound effects. They have assigned voice actors for each character. And it just makes the whole experience so fun. And I feel like I've listened to this book several times, so I feel like I don't have anything like too specific to say. I'm not gonna go too much into the plot because I feel like it's not necessarily like the most complicated or original plot, and it's kind of hard to describe. It's kind of like if you want a classic but modern science fiction book to read about spaceships and space stations and just kind of like interplanetary civilization, I think this is your book. And it's I'm at a loss for words, honestly. I think I've been going on for too long. Sorry. So many books, but I liked how the characters and plot are interesting, and some of the characters are pretty funny. I think it's not not in a bad way. This is not in a bad way. It's not necessarily the most complicated or original plot, but I think it was executed very well, and it's just a fun time, I think, if you just want an easy listening experience with a full cast and fully immersive experience. Sorry, that was a bit of a mess. I think I got a little too excited there. The next book I read is Pachinko by Minjin Lee. And this book, man, it did a number on me. So it follows the story of, I think it's like 4 generations of this one family, starting off in Korea and then to Japan, and how their lives changed, because starting out they're very poor, and then as the characters go through life and the different generations, their circumstances change and they end up becoming very affluent. And you end up just reading from a perspective of not just the family members, but also some of their acquaintances as well, and just getting a look into the details of their lives. So, my feelings about this book, like I said, it did a number on me. It was a roller coaster to read. I really enjoyed the book as a whole. It was very easy to become immersed in the lives of these different characters, and I liked how the writing style would shift to match each character without explicitly telling us that we were reading about the world from another character's point of view. It was pretty easy to tell whether we're like whose character's head we were in, basically, just because even the vocabulary or the sentences, the way the sentences were constructed would be changed to kind of just match that person's personality. So it was there's no guessing. You don't get confused about whose headspace you're in. That said, there were some details that just gave me whiplash or made me very uncomfortable, just because there were a couple of romantic relationships that involved questionable age gaps or ranges, and sometimes we got a little bit too much information about certain characters who, even though there's no like specific plot, I just felt like there were some characters who were just not relevant to the scope of what we were talking about, which was fine. I think it was mostly just the questionable age gaps or like familial relationships involved in the romantic relationships going on. So there's that. But other than that, like I said, as a whole, I really enjoyed the book. It was a good time, mostly. Next book I want to talk about is I'll just talk about these two together because they're from the same series. I started reading the Aurora Cycle, which is another trilogy written by Amy Coffin and Jay Kristoff. This one is, I don't know how to describe it. Let me look at the synopsis for Aurora Rising. So this one kind of reminded me of those books where you have like a 5-man band, basically, except this one I think is 6 or 7 people. I'm off the top of my head, it's like 6 or 7 people where they each have a role and they form a squad, and this military academy. Is it 5 people? I think it's 5 people in the squad, and then we also have this other character who gets introduced named Aurora, and she's the lone survivor of a ship that was lost over 2 centuries ago, and for some reason this squad is told by their commanders secretly that they need to protect Aurora and keep her away from the Earth government. And then that's basically what's happening in this series. They're trying to keep Aurora from getting captured by the Earth government, and then they're also dealing with this other unknown enemy that they soon discover. And I don't know. I don't really have much to say about this series besides, at least for the first book, I don't have much to say about it just because it felt like another solid classic sci-fi story. The characters are pretty fun, and it's I don't know. Yeah, that's about it. I think the second book is where I have more things to say, just because I feel like a lot happened, but we did not really learn much that advanced the plot in a meaningful way in terms of defeating the enemy that I mentioned in the previous book, or learning more about, this is really too much of a spoiler, but learning more about like this ancient mysterious race that is kind of responsible for setting everything in motion. So I think if I had been, at least for the second book, Aurora Burning, if I had been reading it instead of listening to it, I probably would have skimmed quite a bit, because I was reaching the point where something that kind of can happen when you have a lot of different characters is that some characters or plot lines may be stronger than the others, and I think that started to happen in this book because there were certain details that I just found more interesting than others. For example, I really could not care less about any of Aurora's story or character in the second book, which is kind of a shame, because she is basically fulfilling this chosen one role, right? Because she is that lone survivor among thousands of passengers from 200 years ago. But I just didn't care. I was like, I don't know, she just didn't seem to be very interesting to me, just because like a lot of she goes on this training arc, and a lot of the things that she learns in order to be trained up were very vague. Like it would be like the trainer would be like, you know what you need to do, and then Aurora would be like, obviously I have no idea what you mean, I don't know what you mean, like otherwise I would have done it. And then suddenly Aurora would suddenly understand what she knew she needed to do, but we would not know what she would need to do, and then later we were like, oh okay, I see what she needed to do. So it just felt kind of jerky and weird. But yeah, I didn't really care about Aurora, but then on the other hand, I'd be like, I'd be more interested in seeing, like, for example, Finian is one of the other characters in this book. I actually came to really like him, because I think he was really relatable, and he's just, at first, in the first book, he's like a very annoying character, because he's a smartass, and he just makes all these wisecrack comments that you don't really need. But then later on, I think in the second book, you kind of learn that he's just a good guy who cares about his comrades, and is just a nice guy. I don't know, he's my favorite character. And then I also had fun seeing Tyler's plotline, because he ends up meeting a sister of one of his squad mates, and she's just very like scary dog energy, and like she kind of gives like Chihuahua, even though she's very like gives a lot of bark and will bite, but and just having Tyler having to deal with it was just so funny. And then on the other hand, we just had this whole thing going with Aurora, where she's like going through this weird training arc. It just felt, I don't know how it felt. It just felt out of place and just strange. And I just felt like things were just moving very slowly, and I wasn't sure what we were trying to go for exactly, which kind of sucks. But I am going to read the third book just because I am curious, since there does seem to be an aspect of time travel going on that we didn't really get to hear too much about, but there were some crumbs left there, so we'll see how I feel about the end of this series. Last book, because I'm starting to lose my mind, is The Kamogawa Food Detectives by Hisashi Kashiwai. And I read this book on the plane. It was a pretty short book, so which is why I was able to read it so fast. But I read this book in one go, and it made me very hungry, even though I didn't know what half the food ingredients and components were. I would have looked them up, but I didn't have Wi-Fi on the plane, which sucks. And before I continue, let me just quickly explain what this is about. So it is about this father and daughter duo who are food detectives, and they are able to, basically, clients will come to them saying that they would like this specific dish recreated for them. And as food detectives, the father and daughter will perform investigations that are able to sort of recreate these dishes from their clients' forgotten past, and I guess help them kind of reconnect with these lost recipes. So it was a very cute and interesting concept, but I think based on the description, the structure of the book was a little bit different than what I would have expected. There wasn't as much focusing on the investigation aspect. It was actually more on, first of all, specifically like the food that the food detectives would serve to their customers before the clients come in making their requests, just because they do own a restaurant. So the clients would come into that restaurant asking for them, and then they would serve them food. But also just the food that the food detectives were serving to their clients. So I was expecting a little bit more of like seeing that journey of making that investigation to learn more about the details based off of the bits of information the clients initially gave to the detectives. But that wasn't really what happened. And also I was expecting it to be maybe like just focusing on one case, but instead the book was organized to have, I believe it was 5 or 6 different cases, or 5 or 6 different dishes that had to be recreated, and they were all kind of separate from each other. And this kind of meant that while I think this kind of meant that this book would have been better if I read it in parts instead of just in one go, just because each case had a very similar structure, so things started to get kind of repetitive by the end. But that said, I think having these different cases was nice just because I got to learn about these different characters. I think I really liked learning about each unique backstory and what dishes that they were asking to be recreated. That said, I do have some complaints because, like I said, the writing was a little repetitive, but also it felt a little heavy-handed. When it comes to the food, I don't know how to put this, but the author could have been more descriptive about describing what the food actually tasted like, or that experience of eating the foods, or even just any of the other details of the plot, such as the setting or the characters, because there was a lot of telling rather than showing. For example, there were these parts where like when the customers are getting their first meal at the restaurant, instead of kind of describing what the food looks like or something, we would just be getting a long list of the different side dishes and ingredients that were in the food. And as someone who is not very familiar with Japanese foods, it just looked like a big word salad, and it was hard for me to kind of get into the character's head, if that makes sense. Because you could just be, even if it was like food that I was familiar with, I think just providing me essentially a grocery list of items is not enough to immerse me in the story or kind of understand what kind of like, it doesn't evoke any feelings in me, and I think that is the point of a story, is to try to evoke some kind of emotion rather than just boring me with a long, tedious list of food items, because it was almost like, you're listing a bunch of food items, so you're just gonna expect it to know that it tastes good. But I think the story should be focusing on trying to, even if they are simple food ingredients, I think describing that food experience or aspects of that food or how it tasted, how it looked, to create a certain desired effect or evoke a certain emotion would have been better. Or also what I was thinking while I was reading this is, because we have this long list of at least just describing what the food looks like in a very objective manner, having this as a graphic novel would have been really nice, because it would have been really helpful, because as someone who's, like I said, not familiar with a lot of Japanese food ingredients, at least I would be able to see, like, that looks so scrumptious, without necessarily knowing the exact names of these ingredients. So that was what I thought, but it wasn't a terrible time. I think I still enjoyed myself, just because with the food that I was familiar with, and even just getting to learn about how happy these characters were or melancholy they were to try these long-last dishes, was more than enough to make up for the slightly clumsy writing style going on. Okay, how long have I been talking for? An hour and 7. Not bad. Alright, that was my last book that I wanted to talk about. I'm kind of getting loopy from just talking about this for so long. It's been a long time. I hope that you guys were able to either relate to some of my experiences or just found some books that you think are interesting, despite my admittedly slightly messy explanations and reviews. I just wanted to talk a little bit, and I hope you enjoyed it. If there are any people who, specifically with Heavenly Tyrant, like if you guys have any opinions, whether you're agreeing or disagreeing with me, please let me know, because that book, it's been a very long time since a book has made me that angry. It's been 3 months, so I'm not as upset anymore. I've gotten over it, but I just remember being so frustrated reading that, because I really had no idea what I just read. And if you would like me to try to do those plot summaries that you see on YouTube, I mean, let me know. I may just do it anyways, just because it seems fun. Like I said, I just need to sort out my feelings with regards to that. Just maybe organize my thoughts more, and get a better look at the plot once more. So, yeah, I hope everything has been going okay for you guys. Maybe you guys are enjoying the new spring weather, or if it's fall where you are, fall colors. And yeah, that's all I have for today. I'm going to take a break now and go do my homework. I've been recording for over an hour, so I think I'm losing it. Alright. Bye, guys. You thought we were done? Okay. For today's bonus segment, I'm just going to read some quotes that I highlighted from Waterman. Hopefully, some of them will be of interest to you. But if they're cringe, I think that's good, because that means you didn't need to hear it. So, cheers. Here we go. First quote from page 201. Every hope deserves a sparkle in the sky, even for just one night. From page 288. It has allowed us to realize that life is about finding joy in the space between where you came from and where you are going. I may never get to go where I want to go, but I can look back on my life and say that I did not waste a second of it being bitter that I was not someplace else. Happiness does not exist in a place. It lives in every breath we take. You need to choose to take it in over and over again. Here's another quote from the same page. I have learned that there is nothing to be gained from stealing other people's happiness. No matter how much you have stolen, it is not something that you can ever use for yourself. Finally, a quote from page 341. Fall 7 times.